When I was young, about 7 or 8, I was totally captivated by stories of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. Every night, in order to soothe myself as I went to sleep, I'd let my mind wander into a kind of dreamy state in which I was a knight setting off on a quest. Usually it would be Sir Lancelot, because he was the greatest of all the knights, but sometimes it would be other knights. But I'd always be on my horse, in my silver armor, and I'd be setting out to fulfill some sort of quest, to do something which was really important, to do something which was good. Now, if you remember the stories, they always begin in Camelot. The knights are sitting round the round table. It's usually the Feast of Michaelmas. And they've had their food and their drink, and they're now waiting expectantly for something strange to happen. The castle door opens, and someone or something enters. Then there's a challenge, a riddle, a pursuit, or a dishonored maiden who requires revenge. So one or more of the knights feels called and rises to the challenge. In its most profound quest, it's the Holy Grail that appears, and the three best knights, Sir Bors, Percival, and Galahad, set out to discover the Holy Grail. Now, later in my adolescence, I came across the works of Hermann Hesse, and the book of Siddhartha affected me profoundly. Here was a monk who seemed to be on his spiritual path, but somehow it was not to be. That was not his path. His life then, as he got embroiled in the world, was littered with all sorts of mistakes and sufferings and wrong turns, until he was so much in despair about the death of his son. He goes back to the ferryman, and he recognizes the ferryman as his teacher. And through being there, just an ordinary ferryman, he eventually becomes one with the river. So what's the common thread in all of these stories? These are examples of the hero's journey. Now, the outer journey of adventure, as with the Knights of the Round Table, but then Siddhartha is the inner journey of self-realization. We're all very familiar with stories of heroes and their adventures. But in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the hero's inner journey, the way of individuation, the way in which we strive to transcend our egos and our selfish desires and become the best person we possibly can. This is the first part of a two-part presentation. I'll go over the main aspect of the hero's journey, but then I'll focus on the beginning section of the whole journey, the first two parts of the journey, which is the departure and the quest. So what is the hero's journey? This term was first coined by Campbell, Joseph Campbell, and he called it a monomyth, which is the common template for all hero stories. And he wrote about it in a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So he thought about the monomyth as a fundamental pattern for adventure stories. And we can see it stretching all the way back to some of the earliest stories that we know about, like Gilgamesh or the Greek Heracles and the Ulysses sequences. And of course, Hollywood has taken over this pattern and it's become a template for action movies. So then, at another level, we can think of the hero's journey as an archetype of the process of individuation, of the process of inner growth, of becoming more of who we need to become. And we can see some of those stories reflected in, like, the Dante's Divine Comedy, or Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, or, as I've talked about before, Hesse's Siddhartha. So we're thinking about the hero's journey here as a template and a map for every and all spiritual endeavor, everything about growth, everything about change, everything about movement in our inner self. So there's stages on the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell suggested there was 3 acts with 17 stages. I find that a little overcomplicated, but his 3 acts start with departure, and then it moves on to initiation, and finally return. Now, Hollywood has taken those 3 acts, and instead of 17 stages, it's kind of condensed them into 12 stages. And you can see it in all of the main hero stories that we know about in the movies. So George Lucas was heavily influenced by Joseph Campbell, and he consciously plotted Star Wars to match the hero's journey structure. So my favorite of all the hero journeys actually is a movie called Willow, and that's also a story by Lucas. And that's got all sorts of twists and turns, but it follows the template very well. But now I'm going to talk about the hero's inner journey. We've been talking about the outer journey, but for the inner journey, I suggest we need 4 acts. So I separate initiation into 2 parts. So we still have departure, and this is really one of the most important aspects, departure, because without departure, the hero's journey never begins. And I'll talk about that later in more detail. And then the initiation first part is divided into the quest. The quest is that sense of a vision, of questing for something. I talked about that in the Knights of the Round Table, and that is the quest for the Holy Grail is often thought of as a quest, an inner journey as well as an outer journey. And then the quest eventually reaches some sort of realization. Something is achieved. There's some treasure. There's some bad person who's been killed. The world has been changed in some ways for the better. And then there's the return. Once the quest and the realization is complete, we have to come back to the normal world. So in this part of the talk, I'm only going to be talking about the departure and most of the quest, not the whole of the quest. I'll leave the realization and the return for the second part of the inner journey. But you need to think about the inner journey as not just a sequence of events, but it's more like a cycle. And in that sense, we're always at the beginning, particularly in our spiritual life. We're at the beginning and we're experiencing the quest basically at the same time. So departure and quest are the fundamental aspects of the hero's journey. So let's talk about departure. And there's this wonderful quote from Rumi. And you, when will you begin the long journey into yourself? And this is a question that we need to ask ourselves constantly. Because departure is a place that we often get stuck. So it starts with a call. Usually this is an inner call. But with that call comes our resistance. We don't just answer to the call, because our attachment to the ordinary world are very strong and our resistance to change and facing the difficulties of the journey are always with us. So we sense that inner calling to change in some ways, but then we feel ambivalent. We have a dilemma and we resist the call. Now that resistance might mean that we basically don't pay attention to it. We forget about it. We have some sort of experience and we undervalue it. We let it slip away. We think, oh, I should do something about that, but maybe next week. And then hopefully in our resistance, we get some sort of assistance. some sort of unexpected guide, a person, a book, some sort of resource appears. And that resource could be in terms of a synchronicity. It could be something happening outside of us in the world, which somehow resonates and reflects some sort of inner experience. And it wakes us up. Some people will call this a conscious shock, or a way in which we begin to engage fully with our inner experience. And with that engagement comes a greater sense of clarity and a sense of intention. I am going to do something about this. I'm not just going to let it slip away. Then we have to cross the threshold. This is something that Joseph Campbell talked about a lot. The threshold is the threshold, the dividing line between the ordinary world and the world of adventure. For us, from an inner point of view, the threshold is from our outer experience to our inner experience. We have to cross that threshold. That means we have to start to begin the inner journey. And to do that, we have to make a decision to do something. We can't just stay in our same old rut, doing the same things again and again. We have to change maybe our routine. We have to make an intention that we're going to be more loving, or that we're going to do our practice more fully, or maybe it's going to be that we'll enter into therapy. But we have to make a decision and, if you like, a commitment to move forward. And as we move forward, we can't do that unconsciously. We need to do that with intention and awareness. So we gather some sort of tools. Now, from an inner point of view, these are inner tools. These could be something like having a prayer practice or a meditation practice. This could be calling on somebody. We're finding some way to help ourselves on this journey. Now comes the quest. We've crossed the threshold, and now we're going to move inwards. And of course, this isn't easy. This is where the hard bit comes, because it requires a dedication, and it requires that we risk and that we change. So we're going to do a lot of trials. We're going to try things. And trials have two kinds of meaning. One is that we try something, and the other is that we are tried, that we are on trial. And because we risk, we're going to make mistakes, we're going to make errors. And we're going to find that the quest is far more difficult than we expected. It isn't a simple step-by-step progress forward. There's going to be all sorts of confusion. There's going to be difficulties. We're going to lose our motivation along the way. And of course, we always want to avoid suffering. We want to avoid those things which make us uncomfortable. But avoiding suffering when you're on a quest, particularly suffering which is moving something inside you, is going to make it worse. Suffering which is avoided causes suffering. Now, the other part of the quest, which is always going to be there, is our conflicts. From a psychological point of view, we can call these psychological conflicts. We might actually think of them as complexes, aspects of ourselves which seem to be at odds with our consciousness. Things which happen to us, urges, which we don't really want to give into and cause us anxiety or distress. So when these conflicts come, of course, we get doubtful, fearful, and confused. And fearful is probably the main thing that's going to get us stuck at this point. Now, as we work through our doubt, our fear, and our confusion, as we get more into the process, it's very easy to fall into our own rut again. Now, this has been highly talked about. It's been talked about in a lot of detail, beginning with the Desert Fathers in about the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. They would go off into the desert and they were working on themselves. You know, they were Christians, but they were the early Christians. So they had a very different way of approaching Christianity. And they talked about 9 sins, not 7. And one of them was this feeling of despondency in the spiritual life. And they called it acedia. Now, acedia was also called the noonday demon. It was when you're in your prayer practice or your meditation practice and it just seems to get boring. It seems to just weigh you down. You can't face it. It doesn't seem to be doing anything. In Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, it's called the Slough of Despond, one of my favorite phrases. It's that despondency which kind of drags you down. And the Slough of Despond, in Bunyan's terms, is actually a swamp. It's sticky. You're trudging through this sticky morass. And it's very hard and it's very easy to get stuck there. And then, of course, if you look at all the hero stories, there seems to be things seem to be getting better. And then there's this major ordeal and major crisis. Now, in the ordeal and crisis, which I will talk about much more in the second part of this, this presentation, in number 2, we struggle with our deepest and darkest fears and attachments. And these, when we're thinking from an inner point of view, this is our personal shadow. And it's at that time the despondency gets a firm grip on us, kind of hopelessness. And we don't feel as though there's any point continuing. And St. John of the Cross calls this the dark night of the soul. It's where you're no longer feeling any benefit from your spiritual practice. When you're feeling as though there's no reason to go on. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk about the second 2 aspects in part 2 of this presentation. But for the moment, we'll just finish there. And we'll look at the lessons of the hero's journey, particularly the beginning lessons. So the first lesson, which is really useful when you look at the hero's inner journey, is that every spiritual endeavor, every intention to change, to become a better person, the path has a similar shape and a similar process. And what does that look like? Well, first of all, we have to listen carefully for the call. We can't just allow ourselves to go day by day and not listen to what's inside. Now, the call can come in a dream. It can come in an insight. It can come just from a conversation that you have with somebody. So you have to listen carefully and you have to mark it with your attention. And then you recognize your hesitation and resistance. Remember, we're looking at this as a map, and so we're always going to have hesitation, we're always going to have resistance, and we've got to make friends with it, if you like. We've got to understand it and be able to feel it, but not give in to it. So we're getting a little distance, if you like, by following the lessons of the hero's journey, where we're getting a little distance from those inner experiences, and instead of being attached to them and being taken by them, we can actually step back a little bit. So it's always about knowing yourself, your strengths and weaknesses. Now, once we've come across our resistance, we need to look for inner and outer guidance and synchronicities. Something is going to help us. We need to be looking for that, paying attention. And there's this thing where when we open up our attention to the unexpected comes from somewhere else. It doesn't come from our mind. When we look for that in the sense of being open to it, aware of it possibly being there, often we'll see it. Synchronicities are happening all the time. They're all around. So once we've got that sense of the synchronicity, the guidance which comes from inside and sometimes outside, we begin to prepare. What does that mean? Well, preparation takes many different kinds of forms. Sometimes it's an intellectual preparation. We need to learn something. We need some conceptual way to get a grip on what we're experiencing. Sometimes it's emotional preparation, that we need to feel into the experience more deeply. Sometimes it's a physical preparation. We actually need to get fit. We need to get healthy. We need to get strong because there will be difficulties on the journey. The other thing we have to do is expect difficulties. It is going to be difficult. Not always in the way that we expect it to be, too. It's going to have some crises and it's going to have some suffering. But there are two kinds of suffering. There's some sense suffering on purpose, which is for something. It does something. It moves us forward. And there's useless suffering. I had a therapist who always talked about, don't do useless suffering, do useful suffering. Notice the difference between the different kinds of suffering and choose that one that seems to be moving you forward in your inner life. And of course, we always have to guard against losing heart, against that sense of despondency, that sense of just being taken by the world, that sense of, is it worthwhile? Because all spiritual paths, the path of individuation, will come with doubts, and we will be tried. Now, as a little exercise to finish off this part of the presentation, I'd like you to think about honoring your guides. These are not just your heroes, but they're also the guides that have somehow sparked something inside you. So think of the heroes. And who were your heroes when you were young? Now, I've talked about the Knights of the Round Tables. Those were my heroes. I've talked about Siddhartha. He was my hero as I was growing up. But I've had many other heroes, some of them alive, some of them dead, some of them mythical, some of them fictional. So just begin to think, who are my heroes? Because they provide a aspirational aspect for yourself. That you want to be like them, even though you don't notice that, you will actually feel that inside because they're your heroes. And think about who was an inspiration when you were growing up. Now, I had some people who were inspiring to me as I was growing up, but there were many who weren't inspiring. So I had to choose carefully. And there was a long period in my adolescence where I was desperate for a mentor, desperate for somebody to help me. So what I turned to were books. So your inspiration may be books or stories that influenced you deeply. Maybe there's some sort of spiritual book, as I've talked about Siddhartha, but I like most of Hermann Hesse's books. I found them very inspirational. Growing up also, I was inspired by the nuns because I went to a convent school when I was very young. And I was inspired by the reverence, by the devotion that they paid when they were in church. And I knew that they were experiencing something which I wasn't experiencing. And I wanted to experience that. And finally, who would you like to be? Who do you aspire to being like? I know that's not a great way of putting it, but for instance, I got very interested in Mahatma Gandhi at one time. I read a lot about him. And one of the things that's so interesting about Mahatma Gandhi was that he was so neurotic when he was young. He was fearful and very strange. And he managed to overcome those difficulties that they had, those psychological difficulties, and become somebody who changed the world in a big way. I was at a meeting in Naropa, and the Dalai Lama came and talked to us. So it was a small gathering, and what I was inspired by was his presence. The fact that he was so grounded, the fact that he was so earthy, and also so brilliant and so loving. So that's a person I would like to be more like. My first therapist, she was a wonderful woman in her 90s, and I would like to be more like her. She had a sense of quiet and inner calm and connection to some sort of spirit, which was really quite profound. So these are the questions I want you to ask yourself, because we're impacted by everything, and we need to honor our mentors, our teachers, and our models. In the second part of this presentation, the Hero's Journey Part 2, I'll be focusing on realization and return. But we have to realize that the inner journey is a cycle. It goes in a circle or in a spiral. So the return gets us ready for the next departure, the next adventure, the next chapter of our continuing inner journey. Thank you.